Okay, so when we talk about MIDI recording and MIDI hardware, what we're really talking about is some kind of MIDI keyboard, right? Now, here's the thing. When we think about MIDI keyboards, we tend to think about things like this, okay? Now, there's a lot going on here. What we have here is a piano-like keyboard, okay? So it's got the piano keys that you're familiar with. It also has some pads and some dials, okay? These can be mapped to do a whole bunch of different stuff. We'll come back and talk about those later. The keyboard part is what's going to play in notes. Now, what's interesting about this is that most MIDI controllers look like a piano keyboard. And the reason they do is because most people know what a piano keyboard does, right? But other than kind of tradition, there's no real reason that your MIDI device needs to be a piano shaped one. They have MIDI devices for virtually everything if you want. You can find MIDI guitars, you can find MIDI saxophones, MIDI violins, MIDI cellos. So a keyboard is probably the most versatile thing because we can just kind of flop our hands on it and do whatever we want. But if you are skilled with another instrument, you should totally get a MIDI controller that is that instrument, like do what's comfortable. I'll show you a MIDI guitar in a couple videos from now, but back to hardware needs. You need a MIDI controller of some kind if you want to do any kind of MIDI recording and playing. Okay, so this is one. The good thing about these MIDI controllers is that they are made of plastic. They're relatively cheap, like this one is let's see, a Novation Launch Key Mini, and I don't remember exactly, but it's probably about $100 or less. These are not designed to go on tour and be on stage, really. They're kind of cheap plastic things, and they don't need to be anything bigger than that. I showed you earlier the Roland C-board that I have connected to this computer. That's a fancy one. That's like a really fancy one. This is a cheaper one. So don't get anything fancy. If you want a piano-like one, all you really need is some keys, and then you can decide if you want the keys to be full-size piano keys. Do you want them to be weighted keys so they feel like a piano? Most of these are not going to feel like a piano. They're going to feel like pieces of plastic, and that's kind of what they're designed to do. If you want one that feels like a real piano, then you're going to be spending a little bit more. But when you're like programming drums, you don't care if it feels like a real piano or not. This is really our only piece of hardware that we need, is some kind of MIDI keyboard. We don't need an audio interface, although an audio interface may help you. And I'll explain that in just a second. Actually, I'll explain that right now. So when we plug in one of these to our computer, here's how we're going to do it. If you have one like this or anything that's new-ish in the last like 5 or so years, it's going to have a USB output on it. This one, where'd it go? Right here, USB. So I can plug this in just with USB. That's all I need to do. So a lot of audio interfaces have a USB port for this reason. You can plug it into the USB port on the audio interface, but you don't need to. You can put it in any USB port. It's just fine. But if you have anything older, like a bigger keyboard or something, it might have actual MIDI outputs on it. So I was looking around my studio for something that has old school MIDI outputs, and the only device I could find quickly accessible was this. This is a Novation Remote Zero. So this has no keyboard, although they do make a version with a keyboard. It's just controllers, so it's faders, so you can map this to your the faders on the screen. It's got some drum pads and some dials that you can map to do different things. I used to use this as a live performance tool. But on the back, you can see that it has, where are they? Here. These are MIDI outputs and inputs, okay? So they have this 5-pin connection. So I can't easily plug this into my computer. So if I really wanted to use this with the MIDI ports, I need to get a MIDI cable, and I need to have a box that converts a MIDI signal to a USB signal, okay? I can get a cheap little box that does that, or a lot of audio interfaces have that built in as well. So something to consider when you're buying an audio interface, if you want to use an older keyboard like that, you're going to need one that has MIDI ports. Now, luckily, this one has both. It has MIDI ports and a USB right there. So I can just plug this in with USB, which is how I used to use it. So we really just got to plug this into our computer, and then we're good to go. There's some setup stuff we need to do in live, so we'll do that in just a second. But I want to go into another kind of like buyer's guide thing, and also show you how MIDI guitars work while we're on the topic, because I happen to have one right here.